Hey everyone. I have here the NRSV Updated Edition Bible Sampler. This is a free PDF available from Friendship Press. On their website, I'll provide a link in the description. You do have to provide an email to register to get it. But for those of us who are looking forward to the NRSV update, this is pretty exciting as it contains additional information as well as actual verses and passages from the forthcoming update, and comparing them with the current 1989 translation. Some of you may have seen my video from a few weeks ago where I talked about the update and what we knew at the time and what I thought we might expect. And it is nice to get a lot of additional information now. So I'm just going to go through this in this video and share some of what I found interesting and some of the thoughts I had after reviewing the sampler. Here we are in the To the Reader section, and we see right away the NRSVue acronym is sticking, seems to be the official designation for this updated edition. I'm not sure how crazy I am about that and pronouncing it NRSVue, but that seems to be perhaps the direction they're looking to go. I'll probably just call it the updated edition myself. And we see a note here. It just mentions that it continues the work of offering a version as free as possible from the gender bias inherent in the English language. And if you're familiar with the NRSV and its translation philosophy, that shouldn't come as any surprise. I believe it was one of the first, if not the first, translation to really implement gender inclusive, gender accurate language. Here we are in the preface, and it tells us that the updated edition will present approximately 12,000 substantive edits and 20,000 total changes, including alterations in grammar and punctuation. So that should give us some idea of what to expect in terms of how big an update this is. We also see in the preface here on page 15 that it's going to include a considerable number of changes to the Apocrypha in the updated edition. So if you read the Apocrypha, include that as part of your Christian tradition, that's something to be aware of. And the last thing that caught my eye here in the preface is that it says a careful reader will notice in general a more generous use of the notes for alternative readings. And I like hearing that. That's something I appreciate, having variant manuscripts and readings in the notes. And we'll see some examples of that. On page 17, we see a paragraph here talking about the translation of the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, and it just notes that it will continue to translate it as Lord, or in certain cases, God. So following well-established traditional practice that we're used to in English Bibles. And now we're on page 20, and we're getting into the sample revisions, and this is, of course, I think what a lot of us are really looking for and excited about. Starting with text critical changes, we have an interesting one here right away. In 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 16, it notes that there's going to be some additional text added based on evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran. And what we see here is that the now complete verse in the NRSV-UE says, "Since the days that I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I have not chosen a city from any of the tribes of Israel in which to build a house, that my name might be there." And then it adds, "Nor did I choose anyone to be a ruler over my people Israel, but I have chosen Jerusalem in order that my name may be there, and I have chosen David to be over my people Israel." So quite a bit's being added there. I actually was not familiar with this particular textual issue concerning the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it appears no other major translations include this. I looked at the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, which I had shown you in my last video concerning some additions that were made in Samuel in the present NRSV. And show you, here's the reading it offers of that verse, and we see that it contains the text from the Dead Sea Scrolls that is now being included in the update to the NRSV. And then here is the footnote that's offered there. And it notes that the Masoretic text omits the addition that we're now seeing, having skipped from the first occurrence of my name to be there to the second. The Septuagint omits the first clause but retains the second, having skipped from nor did I choose to but I chose. The Masoretic text of Chronicles retains the entire reading intact. This reconstruction is strongly indicated by the repetition of over my people, the manuscript spacing, the partial parallel in the Septuagint, and the full parallel in 2 Chronicles. So that's what they offer as the basis for suggesting that change, in the NRSV updated edition is accepting it. And this is just of interest. I think it's worth noting the NRSV and now the updated edition continues to include readings from the Dead Sea Scrolls that are not accepted by and large by other major translations. We're looking now at an example in Acts chapter 9, verse 8, where they note there'll be an additional note about a variant reading, although they're not changing the verse. And that aligns with what we saw earlier, that there would be more notes about variants. So here in verse 8, we see Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. And there'll now be a note that says, other ancient authorities read, no one, instead of nothing. We're looking now at philological updates. And this is an interesting example here for me, since I'm currently reading Leviticus. This is chapter 4, verse 8, although really it's all throughout Leviticus. We have this phrase, sin offering. And it's interesting if you're reading Leviticus, because you'll see like a sin offering has to be made in chapter 12 after a pregnancy, or well, after giving birth, really. And you think, well, why? It's, that's not a sin, but it notes they're going to change it to purification offering. And that's in line with the kind of notes we see in the New Oxford Annotated Bible, 5th edition. We see here, this is verses 6 through 8 in chapter 12, and it says, sin offering, better purification offering. The new mother has committed no sin. She must present a purification offering because her impurity polluted the altar. And that's going to be represented now in the actual translation. And we see that over 125 verses will be changed as a result of this change. Here in Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, we see that the traditional translation of wise men will now be represented as Magi in the updated edition, and they cite the use of it in other Bible translations, and that it's well known in English now as a reason for doing so. Looking now at a section called Challenging Words, starting on page 22, and we see Leviticus 13:9. They're making a change here of leprous disease to defiling skin disease. And that aligns with what I know, which is that the term that's behind this is not necessarily referring to leprosy. In the footnote in the current NRSV, it states a term for several skin diseases, precise meaning uncertain. So they're just making this more generalized to reflect that. On the following page, we're now seeing some verses that may lead to some debate. First thing we note here, they're at Galatians chapter 1, verse 11. It notes that for the sake of inclusivity, the NRSV often translates the plural form of Greek Adelphos as brothers and sisters. It notes that the updated edition will extend this practice and employ it in other instances where both genders are envisioned. For example, changing beloved to brothers and sisters in 1 Thessalonians 4:10. And then they note, however, Adelphos is not intrinsically gender exclusive, so the updated edition omits the standard textual note that's currently included in the NRSV. And we see that here, again in Galatians 1:11. Previously, we had a note that said Greek brothers, going with brothers and sisters. That note will not be included now. And then the next verse here that this is also interesting is Matthew 4:24. They note that terms referencing physical disabilities pose particular challenges when a translation attempts to honor both ancient realities and modern sensibilities. When context permits, the updated edition will avoid translations that identify people in terms of a disability, as in Matthew 4:24. So we see, for example, instead of paralytics, they're going to have afflicted with paralysis. I wasn't sure, when I read this, I thought, well, that sounds good, in terms of how we talk about things in our culture today. But I don't know a lot about this. And I asked Mrs. TSB because she's an educator and she works with a variety of students and who have a variety of needs. And I was curious what she thought about this, and she made some good points. So I actually have her right here, and she's going to talk a little about this sort of change.
Hello. So, as Mr. TSB mentioned, I am an educator. I'm a speech therapist specifically. And this is actually a really hot topic in the speech therapy world and just in special education in general right now. So, when I was attending graduate school back in around 2007, we were taught to refer to students who had disabilities using person first language. So, today I saw a 10-year-old boy who has autism rather than an autistic 10-year-old boy, to really emphasize the other aspects of the child rather than their disability. But now we're actually seeing a reverse, and the reverse is coming from the people who have the disability speaking out for themselves. So, for example, people who have autism are actually starting to prefer being labeled as autistic because that's part of who they are. Some people view that as a key part of their identity. Once again, I'm speaking of a group in broad strokes, so that doesn't speak for every person who has a specific disability. So my thoughts would be that the translators should reach out to the different groups who do have these disabilities and see what do they prefer, what would they like to see, and what would be most honoring to them.
Thank you, Mrs. TSB. That's a really great point. And that's a great question. I wonder if the translators did, I don't want to say consult with people. For example, in this case, paralysis, did they consult with people who are paralyzed, and how they would want to see that translated differently? That's a really great point.
Glad to share any insight, and I'd be interested to hear your viewers' experience and what their thoughts are on this.
See, this is why I brought her on. See, because that's a great point too. If any of you out there have experience with this or thoughts on it, yeah, please share in the comments. Now we're looking at stylistic changes, and we're in Hosea chapter 1, verse 2. And it notes that the editors are updating archaic language to modern equivalencies. And they say, thus, fornication is generally changed to sexual immorality, and various forms of whore terms were revised to comparable forms of prostitute. And they've got examples of that down here. And we see that instead of having, say, take for yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, we see instead, take for yourself a wife of prostitution and have children of prostitution. I understand changing that. I think whore, it just tends to be used as a curse, just a kind of a real nasty sort of word in our language today. At the same time, I'm not sure the phrasing there really sounds that great to me. Obviously, I'm well familiar with this kind of very traditional phrasing here, so it may just be that's what I'm used to. But, it doesn't bother me. I think they're doing perhaps the best they can given what they're trying to accomplish. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 22, it notes that language of enslavement is undergoing changes as well, to highlight the fact it is an imposed condition, not an intrinsic aspect of a person's being. So we see, instead of it saying Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and the other by a free woman. It says that he had 2 sons, one by an enslaved woman and the other by a free woman. The last sample revisions I want to share are examples of changes to notes. We see that cross-references to other biblical verses are generally being deleted. Of course, the external set of cross-references will remain available for publishers to include, and I hope the external set gets fixed and updated. Some of you know there are some errors and some omissions in the current set. The other thing they note is that textual notes offering interpretive hints, such as in John 12:5, it tells us 300 denarii would be nearly a year's wages for a laborer, are also going to be removed. And I would assume probably the reason for doing these types of changes is these are things that may be better put in a reference Bible or a study Bible, etc., rather than having it as part of the actual translation. On page 32, we're looking at availability, and we already know that we're going to get the digital edition sometime in November, but we see printed editions will not be released apparently until May 1st, 2022 or later. And that means I'm going to be waiting a little bit longer because that's really what I want. I looked at the information for Friendship Press's eBible. I'm not sure. It sounds like I have to have a certain app or something, and it's $10, and I didn't totally understand it, but I am really just going to wait for a printed edition or being able to use it on YouVersion or something. We see there's several publishers who are committed to release an updated edition of the NRSV. Oxford, of course, should be no surprise. I would imagine they will have a new update to the NOAB using the updated translation. And we see a lot of other big names, Zondervan, Cambridge, etc. I had someone on my last video concerning the NRSV comment that the translation has no future, and I don't usually care to respond to kind of very blanket negative statements like that, but I think we can see here it definitely looks like it has a future. We see a lot of publisher support for this update. No, it's not going to be like the ESV or NIV, etc., in terms of how many units it sells and how well it's accepted, but it is a strong, established translation, and it looks like it will continue to be so. So after going through the Bible sampler, seeing the notes and the sample revisions, what do I think? Well, I think it looks pretty good, actually. From the little bit that we're being shown now, most of the changes make sense to me. I don't see anything that really jumps out at me as a big problem or anything that, would drive me away. In fact, I think it makes me all that more excited to get my hands on a copy of the updated edition of the NRSV. So, what do you think? Have you had a chance to look at the sampler? Anything here jump out at you as a big positive or a big negative? I'd love to hear about it. I'm sure others would too. Share it in the comments. If you found this helpful, informative, entertaining, insightful, please click like. And if you'd like to see more from me, videos on thrift Bibles and other things that interest me, I invite you to subscribe. Thank you for watching. God bless, and we'll see you for the next one.